Hello, I'm Peter Stein. I'm senior programmer for Frameline, and welcome to Queer Legacies, one of nearly a dozen conversations and panels that we're offering during this year's Frameline Festival. I'm so glad you've joined us, and I want to say a special thanks to our sponsor for this conversation, TiVo, as well as to Variety for supporting all of our talks this year. Now, today's conversation, Queer Legacies, was prompted by the fact that a number of films in this year's festival seeks to fill in missing pieces of queer history in very inventive ways that help correct the record or that give fuller voice to the richness of the lived queer experience, even when that richness has been unavailable in the collective archive. So if you haven't already seen the terrific documentaries, P.S. Burn This Letter, Please, or Rebel Dykes, or Nellie Queen, The Life and Times of Jose Sarria, Frameline will be streaming these films through the end of the festival on June 27th. Do try to catch them all. Now, to moderate our discussion and to contribute his own expertise as a public historian and a student of the Queer Archive, I'm thrilled to welcome Gerard Koskovich to the conversation. Welcome, Gerard. Now, by way of background, Gerard is a founding member of the GLBT Historical Society in San Francisco. He has been active in the movement to create LGBTQ archives and museums for 4 decades, and I'm a big fan of Gerard's work as an activist, as an archivist, and a public historian. So I'm going to disappear, and Gerard is going to take it away. We're in good hands with him. Welcome, and thank you, Gerard.
Thank you so much, Peter. I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to moderate today's conversation with the makers of 3 new documentaries focusing on LGBTQ history. All of these films bring us new and interesting ways of looking at our recent past from the 20th century and bring exciting and inspiring voices to the screen. So taking part in the discussion today, we have Joe Castle, who's the director of Nellie Queen, The Life and Times of Jose Sarria. We have Jennifer Teixeira, co-director of P.S. Burn This Letter, Please. We have Shimon Fahy, a producer and subject in Rebel Dykes, also from Rebel Dykes, the 2 co-directors, Harry Shanahan and Sean Williams. And I'm delighted that for each of these films, there was this really personal connection for me since I saw people I know and people I love in every one of these films sharing something of their past. And I also saw documentary and archival material from the collections of the GLBT Historical Society in each of the films, a reminder why our community-based queer archives are so important. And having had a chance to preview all of the films, what I can say is that they all look at the second half of the 20th century, one focusing largely on New York, one largely on San Francisco, one largely on London, but at the same time, they trace the lives of their subjects beyond those cities and give us a really strong reminder that the queer past is with us wherever we go and wherever we are. Each of the films is intriguing in its own way, with varied styles of storytelling and filmmaking, but with a shared commitment to recording the memories of our astounding LGBTQ elders and ensuring the intergenerational transmission of their personal experiences, their historical knowledge, and their wisdom, something that all of us need at every age as members of the LGBT community. They all also portray individuals whose pursuit of queer personal and cultural liberty turned respectability on its head. All the films suggest that knowledge of our queer past can help us develop resilience and can inspire visions of a freer society for our present and for the future. And all of them remind us that fighting repression and having a good time can go hand in hand, that in fact, insisting on having a good time is one of our forms of resistance. And now what I'd like to do is turn things over with some questions for the filmmakers. And to start right off, I'd like to ask our filmmakers why they think LGBTQ history matters to them personally, to the LGBT community, and to society in general. And Joe offered to jump in first on this question.
Well, thank you, Gerard. For any kind of history, basically, you need to know your identity, right? And especially with people of color, we carry our identity, on our face and our skin color. So a lot of people may not know their history, but I think it's still ingrained into their psyche, and it helps them define who they are and defend who they are. In a sense, sometimes we have to defend it. And I think for young LGBTQ people, they need to see that there were courageous activists who came before them. They need to know that what it was like to live under some horrible oppressions, and that our civil liberties are fragile freedoms that need to be protected. And they weren't always granted to us, people not color, of course, but also LGBTQ persons. So in California, it was against the law to assemble publicly anywhere, restaurant, cafe, to be known, to be out. And Jose Sarria, the subject of my film, fought that back in the early 50s, all the way for the rest of his life, basically. But there was a landmark decision in the early 50s that he helped defend that gave gay people the right to assemble in public. And that was a major milestone that people do not know. Most people do not know that he helped defend that law. And I know it's going to sound controversial, but people, they say, oh, Stonewall is where it started. But, it really kind of started in San Francisco back in the early 50s when they started to gather that movement of defying the police, defying the policies and organizations. And because of that, because they kept coming back at them, Jose ran for political office in 1961, and he was the first openly gay man to run for public office. And people do not know that. Mm-hmm. And why do they not know that? One, he was a person of color. Two, he wore a dress. And so I think that, the reason I made this film is because we need to smash those preconceived notions that just because a man wears a dress or a woman decides to take on, masculine manners or traits, that these people have nothing to say or nothing to contribute or not even intelligent, And so you could be locked up, in Jose's time, you could be sent to a mental institution, you could be given a lobotomy, you could be sent to prison, you would lose your job. And people don't know how fragile our civil liberties are. They just
Indeed,
don't.
It was a dark era, and Jose was one of the people who brought some light to it. Let me put a question to Shuman at this point, and that is, what do you see? And this really jumps very easily from what Joe was saying. What do you see as the creative potential that's to be found in our LGBTQ archives and in turning them into work like films or exhibitions?
Yeah, it's been an incredible journey for me and the other filmmakers. I'm sure Sean and Harry will join in the sort of creativity that's been with Rebel Dykes. So I'd never really dealt with archive prior to this film, so I didn't really see the beauty of it until we started making the film. And when it was worked on by Sean and Harry, who were younger queers, who weren't around when the film was set, when they took the archive and started working with it and creating with it, it really showed to me the sort of creative potential. And our project has gone on to do that with working now with artists in London. Well, they're not just all London artists, but we're putting on an exhibition in London in a couple of weeks from June to September, which was all about the archive and asking younger artists to respond to it. So I have really begun to see over the past few years of working on this film and with the archive of how inspirational it is to queer artists of younger, both the subject matter, but also what we're actually seeing, the visuals of it, have been a delight to work with, to understand the textures of archive and how it can come alive and how adding colour. If it's okay, I would like to Harry and Sean, my collaborators, to speak, join in.
I think, as you were saying, I think again, until we got into the deep stages of the editing, I was sort of like, oh my God, we've got a handful of photos, and some zines. But looking at those, I think looking at how creative Rebel Dykes were, they were kind of they didn't have money. A lot of people were, you know, kind of living on the street or squatting or whatever. So there wasn't resources there, but people were just making these amazing kind of little, just drawing pictures, photocopying them, sticking them up, making their own posters, and using that as a basis for the animation, and how that blended then with the recreation was something that was a really fun creative challenge, because you end up replicating those processes. So I was, yeah, we Sean and I kind of took our lead from that kind of creativity, and but the fact that people saved the flyers, they saved posters, you know, people kept these things in shoe boxes for 30 years. I'm incredibly grateful that they did, you know, and I've started keeping all my flyers now, just in case someone wants to make a documentary in the future.
Just to add to that, because I'm an archivist for a day job, so like I was seeing like this problem or this absence, you know, a gap, particularly for lesbian stories, and particularly they'd never actually be about their sex lives or anything, you know, about desire. Like it would be low numbers, you know, the occasional like news story about, you know, a homophobic judge taking their kids away, but it would never be these stories that we've told in Rubble Dykes. So yeah, it was to kind of redress that, and also to kind of run with the fact that there's such an absence in archive, and that to basically be integral to our kind of strategy in storytelling.
I think, I mean, the great thing about the project, the wider project, is that it has so much stuff that we gather, particularly Siobhan was gathering in the research stages of this, is now going into archives. So we've actually increased the archive by quite a large amount, and it's going, a lot of the photographs and flyers and ephemera that we collected for the film has gone into the Bishopsgate Institute archive in London, which is fantastic.
Oh, how fantastic. What a wonderful organization. I've been there many times. Jen, I know that your film was sparked by an amazing discovery of a lost archival resource. Would you like to talk a little bit about this as well?
Sure. So yeah, the producer of the film, Craig Olson, found a treasure trove, a box of letters in a storage unit. Craig, being a drag queen himself, as he started reading these letters, he always says, first of all, he felt like he shouldn't be reading them. They were so personal, and but also so beautiful and celebratory. And he kind of had this thought that these guys were drag queens, and they were. So that started a 5-year journey. You know, as many of the other panelists have said, you know, queer history, you just really don't hear that much about it before Stonewall, especially here in the States. On top of that, there's just not a lot that exists in archives. When we took the letters to our historians that we feature in the film, all of them collectively said, you know, we had written our books based off of police records or hospital records, or these really, you know, it came from these dark places. And these letters were these queens living their best lives in New York. And that really set the tone for the film. It was, like I said, it was a really intense journey, not only trying to locate these queens to see if any of them were still alive. They would be in their late 80s, early 90s, but also the archive as well, with the help of a very determined co-director, Michael Seligman, who's amazing at research, and the help of a PI that we had to enlist, because we only had, you know, these queens, they were in hiding as well. You know, they used their drag names. We didn't have their real names. We had maybe had a birthday. We maybe had a return address. But you know, the letters were written from 52 to 62. So this happened a long time ago. We were able to track down 9 queens eventually who reconstructed that history of being in New York in the 1950s, being drag queens that worked for the Club 82 and the Moroccan Village that were run by the mafia. And as we started peeling these layers back, it just got more incredible. And all the way up to a week before our premiere at Tribeca, we discovered an entirely new archive and had to recut it all into the film. So it was, I mean, and we're still finding things. So I think that this is just an exciting time for queer history, for people of, you know, history for people of colors, because people want their history, and we have the opportunity to start to rewrite it. And put ourselves back into it.
Certainly one of the things I find exciting about all of these films is that they are original works of historical research. They're not simply making a movie about an existing story. They're creating historical knowledge by finding original sources, bringing them together, sharing voices we haven't heard from ordinary people who are down in the streets living and fighting for their queer lives. It's so exciting to see films like this that really are contributing to the historical record and to the archive. So let me ask, what prompted the focus of each of the films? And I'm thinking particularly whether you set out to fill a gap in the historical record or to correct popular misconceptions or to ensure that the memories of our elders were preserved. Did you come to making the films with some objectives, or did you develop some objectives in the courses of making them about what your focus was going to be, what these films were for?
Hi, just to say, it's kind of in response to all of those things. Yeah, it was, to get these untold stories out there, to redress that archive, the absence that we've just talked about, but also to correct some misconceptions, because I guess a lot of rebel dyke culture, if it is known, is kind of like the mainstream kind of appropriated form that happened in the 90s. So it's kind of like how things can be kind of severed from their origin. So we're trying to like pull the timeline back, a bit like what Joe was saying from Stonewall, to kind of show that the influence was much earlier and that impact has led on. So for like an example would be how, everyone's heard of Madonna's like Sex Book, but has everyone heard of Della Grace Volcano's Love Bites, which, came out before it and has obviously been,
strongly based upon that work, I would say.
Or even just,
inspired by it.
Things like Tank Girl's haircut or Sinead O'Connor with a shaved head and a leather jacket. Like, these are all stylistic things that, have been kind of removed from their origins. So that's kind of like little points of mainstream culture that we wanted to bring back, but there's kind of like more to it.
Yeah, there was a sense that, I remember having a discussion with Siobhan early about, I think with you as well, actually. I remember what Siobhan said about it, which, I was talking about impartiality and whether we needed to kind of go and talk to some of the people who were disagreeing with the rebel dykes. And Siobhan said something and it stayed with me. She said, that lot have had their say and we haven't.
Yeah.
And that's what it kind of, it's just like, let's pass the mic to these people who haven't had a chance to say their side and put their side and because the people who were against them were the ones writing the books and sitting in the local councils and were in positions of influence. And these were, young kids, really. So yeah, it was about that, redressing that balance for sure.
So all of your films started out and ran up against the gaps in the archival record and the challenges of finding the material to tell your stories, and the tantalizing sense that there was more of the story just inches beyond where you had gotten. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about further about the strategies that you used for discovering these archives, for reaching the sources that you interviewed, for beginning to bring together the material that you needed. Jen talked about that a bit with the amazing challenges they faced. How about our other filmmakers? Give us a sense of what the obstacles were and how you managed to overcome them, or if you encountered ones you couldn't overcome.
The cost of archival footage. Some of it was just outrageously expensive. Thank goodness for the historical society, LGBT San Francisco Historical Society, because I made a deal with him that I would give him all my footage of Jose, all my archival footage of interviews with him in the coronations, him and his cemetery marches, in exchange for their material. So they were kind enough to do that for me. So but that was definitely a challenge, because you had to, you feel like you're kind of recreating this false narrative. And so I tried to be as on point with history. Like if I took Jose was in World War II, and he was in the Battle of the Bulge, and so I felt it was necessary to show footage from that battle, not from some other battle, but from that battle specifically. I thought that was very important. And so those things kind of became a challenge because you wanted to be as accurate as possible. Because if he was still alive, he would hammer me for it. So I just kept thinking that, he would say, that's not the battle, or this is not, how it was portrayed. So I always had to keep that in the back of my mind because I had such tremendous responsibility. Not just for portray Jose, but portray history. And that's a tremendous responsibility. I don't know how other filmmakers.
I think we took a very different angle, if I may say, Harry and Sean, and perhaps more creative from a different way. So we started off from the archive. That's what I put out a call. I had access because I was a Rebel Dyke. So it started off with me putting a call out amongst the community to get the archive. Sometimes the archive was a rumor for years and it took us a long time to actually get it. So for instance, the footage inside the BDSM club Chain Reaction, that took us many years to get. We heard about it, but it was many years before we actually saw it. And then we saw different versions. And similar to the debate, it was talked about for many years, but it was many years before somebody actually came along with the VHS tape, which we quickly digitized. And so, yeah, so it came really that way. It's interesting you talk about purchased archive. For many reasons, for many challenges, we were mainly an unfunded film for many years, so there was absolutely no option of paying for archive. But I love the way that Sean and Harry don't understand a challenge or how to not take a challenge. So any archives in archive, Harry would just say, I'm going to become an animator and fill it in. Or Sean would say, right, I've got a camcorder, I can recreate it so that it looks like archive. Some of the stuff you think is archive in our film might not be. So it's a very different approach, perhaps, to Joe.
I think we were trying to, no, I appreciate what you're saying, Joe, though, about wanting to be accurate. And I think in the case of your story, it's like, it's one person's story and he wanted to be on point. Now, we had a different challenge in that we're telling a story that's remembered by a whole bunch of people who remember it differently. And a lot of them were high at the time. So, we're talking more about collective experience and memory. So what we tried to do was we tried to be emotionally true to what the women had experienced. And we tried to depict things in the way that they talked about what it was like to be a Rebel Dyke, but we just weren't able to, most of the buildings where this thing happened been knocked down, and we had to go to rundown bits of northwest England to film stuff that would look like 80s London, because London now is just completely made of glass. So we had a completely different way of dealing with it.
It was more that our strategy of like animation and recreation were kind of like to build these worlds, to kind of show memory in a kind of maybe a different way. For instance, like, yes, it would have been nice if we had the funds, I'm not going to, well, we will admit that, some of these choices are pragmatic solutions, like not being able to get the BBC to give us the news footage.
I'm glad they didn't.
But we're so glad now because, I don't know, it shows more what it's like to be a Rebel Dyke, like, about how it's scary and exhilarating at the same time, or they're doing a political act, but they're having fun. So I think that playful aspect of a recreation kind of is much better than, I don't know, in the UK, everyone's seen that news footage on some kind of like end of year clip show. So I think, yeah,
in case people don't know what we're on about, basically we had to recreate a famous action, but we weren't allowed the footage. So we just did it with like stupid cardboard masks on and like the worst green screen ever. And it ended up but it ends up working in the film for us. And we had fun doing it.
We certainly.
No, I do the same thing.
The films is that all of you bring stylistic choices and narrative structural choices to your films that end up reflecting the story that you're telling and furthering the story that you're telling. In some ways, in P.S. Burn This Letter, Please, which has a very polished and almost stately appearance, it struck me how much the Queens would just love being approached in that fashion, that they are being given the respect that they are entitled to. And Rebel Dykes looks like it was made by a bunch of Rebel Dykes telling their own story. And so it really reinforces it. And the film on Jose brings together all of the amazing footage of Jose talking, which was perhaps his life's greatest accomplishment. accomplishment. Anyone who met Jose was in for a 4-hour conversation. And it really has that feeling of intimacy, telling Jose's story through his own eyes. So to me, the films look quite different and produce different forms of historical knowledge that are perfectly chosen for their subjects. So my hat is off to all of you. Let me ask just a couple more questions. One, for me as a historian, in public presentations that I've done and in doing oral histories with elders, one of the delicate subjects or subject matters I've had to approach is the ways in which our history embodies really serious trauma and great suffering and pain at the same time that we're encountering these amazing characters with inspiring stories. How did you approach as filmmakers talking with elders about those painful memories? And how did you approach bringing them into your films in ways that people would be able to experience them, understand them, and learn from them? Anyone want to jump in on that?
I can jump into that. I think that what was so extraordinary about PS was each of our elders said no when we first contacted them. First of all, it was like, who is this? How do you know that name? The letters were all written by an individual named Reno Martin, which is a reveal in the film. I think that, you know, I've been in documentary for about 17 years now. We call it the courtship process. And I think it is something that it's a very long, complicated, and ultimately beautiful process. I think that it's a lot of not showing up with a camera, basically making sure that you're as honest and open with your characters. They're trusting you with their story and their lives, and you need to make sure that you guys have a common goal. So I think that it was less about, can we come and will you be in this documentary? It was, can we come and meet you? In the case of Michael Logna, it was 6 months of courtship before he agreed. With Terry Noel, it was, she had never shared her story. She tells her story of transitioning in 1961, had never shared it publicly, let alone on film. So we went to where she lives and spent about a week with her until she felt comfortable. And then once we sat down, like, the floodgates just opened up, and it really became this beautiful, cathartic, incredible experience. But each of them had their reservations up to the point where, like, we had finished the film, and Daisy D, or Lenny, was just like, I don't know, like, I don't know that I can be in the film. And we're like, okay, well, let's talk about this. Let's because he still had those, it was that his nephew might see it and judge him at the past that he had lived. So it was just a really complicated process. It was really just ultimately making sure that we were completely on the same page, as Joe said, making sure that we were completely on the same page with the characters whose story that we were trying to tell. That was first and foremost. And ultimately it became a very loving familial relationship. They're still our family. I talked to each of them. We lost a couple in the last year, which has been devastating because, we're finally getting our New York premiere in June. And so it just, that was just really, really difficult. But they're our family, and we love them so much. And, we involve them in every step of the way.
Any of our other filmmakers want to weigh in a bit on that, on approaching those painful aspects of the story with your subjects?
Well, for Jose, I had to peel him back like an onion because he just kept everything so close, especially the painful memories. And about his lover, I had to take him actually to the cemetery where he was buried, and he didn't even know where he was buried. He didn't even know where he was at. So I had to take him there. And that was like the only time he really talked about his partner and some of the regrets that he had and the conflicts he had. So that took 15, 20 years. Yeah. To get him to actually to open up about that, because he would just not speak about that part of his life, his lover and losing that lover, and then what happened in the aftermath because of the guilt and the regret. So it was, but we were friends already. So I like the word, the term that Jennifer uses, courting. So I was courting him for 23 years. So, I didn't start making the film to pretty much putting together after he passed and putting all these archival footage, just basically just intimate conversations we would have around the kitchen table, when he didn't feel pressured, like this is a documentary and it's about your life. He was very closed. So I just kind of like had to be real, not sneaky, but just, okay, let's talk about this today. And that's when he would open up. Yeah.
I think we had a different situation entirely from you guys because first of all, we had access because Siobhan was Rebel Dyke, and the first people that we spoke to were people that Siobhan was either already friends with and had this history with, or people that she'd met on her oral history project, which the film sprung from. So that was great. But then, of course, we weren't trying to tell a story that had already, that was already defined. We had some things that we thought probably defined a Rebel Dyke and things that we felt defined this movement, but we were able to just ask people, what are you comfortable speaking to? What aren't you comfortable speaking to? And then everybody got their transcripts afterwards, so they were able to redact. So we didn't have that same kind of difficulty gaining access. But we are talking about, one of the things in the film that people do talk about is actually that they were processing their trauma at the time, some of them.
Yeah. Particularly in there's one sequence where Madge is talking about the cabarets, which were these kind of performances that took place in this. We think it's the world's first women's sex club, Chain Reaction, and it's just about how, it became part of the story to just talk about how the kind of homophobia and harassment that they faced in the street, that they would kind of process it like live in front of people through public acts,
for beating each other up,
and
some of them have subsequently sort of said, well, maybe that's not maybe how I would choose to deal with my issues now. But when these people are in their early 20s, they're getting really into the idea of catharsis as a healing exercise in itself. So I think we ended up talking about that. There were things that we took out of the film that we felt we didn't want to traumatize the audience, essentially, but
particularly there were some like full interviews that we had to remove, sadly, and the occasional story, and it could be because of someone's job or a child custody issue or something like that. So it does show that sadly there's still a lot of shame around things like sex work, and that it's still not easy to speak about them on a public platform, especially if your life has moved on.
So we did, so we had a lot of dialogue with the contributors, and we kind of spoke to them all the way through, as you both were saying, Jen and Joe, about having this relationship and keeping this relationship. And then we had a relationship as well with sort of about 100 people on the Facebook group that Siobhan was running, which was like a kind of constant information finding service. And it was like, who's in this photo? Please tell us who was so-and-so's girlfriend. Everyone had changed their names, and this kind of thing. So we had that kind of context as well. So that kind of helped.
All of your comments remind me very much how much we need to be grateful for the courage shown by the subjects in your films, coming forward, telling these often painful, difficult stories about their past, and stories that might, by being honest about their past, create some complications for the present, but also open possibilities for the present. That there's really an tremendous amount of courage on display in each of these films. My hats are off to all of them as well. Let me close with one question that I suspect all of you will have something to say about, and that's to ask what you learned from the subjects of your films. Did portraying them and their stories offer you any life lessons, any principles that might be useful for thinking about our present day in the LGBT community, or for ways we might imagine our futures? So what sort of learning did you come away with from your films? And anyone who wants to jump in on that first, perhaps Joe, you'd like to give that a first shot?
Sure. Basically just to be comfortable with myself. Jose was, I coming from Iowa and meeting him right out of grad school, he was like, I had never met anyone so comfortable being gender fluid. He pick up a hammer as easy as a lipstick holder. Put on a wig as easy as the tools. You need to do carpentry with. I mean, he could just. And then I remember seeing him at night. He was in his little nighty gown, like my grandmother would have, and he looked like my grandmother. And it's like he was just that fusion of being the two spirits of masculine and feminine. And I never ever met anyone so comfortable. Now we're having more, but I think it's so important for people who are gender fluid, who are transgender, that they can become comfortable with it. They don't have to have problems, or transgender youth, or the suicide rate is so high. Why? Because they're not comfortable in their own skin. And Jose was just always there for young people, and I think that's something we have to pass on.
Jen?
Sure. I think it was, I've learned so much from them. I mean, yes, Joe, the one thing that our queens across the board said to us is not one of them had any regrets, that they couldn't imagine being anyone but themselves. I think additionally to that there was such a misconception, I know, especially here in the States, that gay men in the 1950s were closeted, or they had these secret families. When we were doing our research, it was about this Mattachine society, which actually rejected people in drag. And I think that they've completely smashed that misconception. They were living their best lives. They were living their lives. They were living it up in New York. Just the language in the letters was that of joy and celebration, and they had such a strong community. It really just kind of flips everything that we had heard or learned up to that point on its head. And ultimately, I think that what you can take away from each of these films is take the time, speak to all your elders. You can never imagine what is in attics and basements and storage units. All of our best archive was randomly placed and was in those places. They'd never been seen before. We discovered an entire archive, which makes up a lot of the archive in the film, in Philadelphia of all places, in an attic. I also think that, something that I really love about this process is something that you alluded to, Joe, is that you're trading your footage for the footage in these archives. I think that is so important. And a lot of the more not LGBT archives that we used, we found that the archive was mislabeled. We were finding images of drag queens in mental health conditions or issues, just really tragic situation. And so I think by us making these projects, we're relabeling the archives. We're allowing the masses to be able to find this history that belongs to them. I would say that those were like the three biggest things that we took away from making PS and from our characters.
Thank you, Jen. Harry and Sean, as the younger parties in the making of Rebel Dykes, what's your sense of what you came away with as something that you learned from your subjects and from working on the film?
I think the big one for me is to just, what's the point in holding any shame? These people were just shameless. I fucking love that. So yeah, just as like role models to aspire to, that the relationships that they built in the 20s, they were queer families that have become, lifelong friendships. They all go on holidays still together. Even the community group brought old friends back together. So there's that. And I guess just being inspired by particularly how the Rebel Dykes kind of, they linked up with like gay male culture, to fight oppression. And I just think that, yes, it is still useful to have, particular niche identity labels
and spaces.
Yeah, it's obviously important, but it's also important to basically to look wider and
to have a dialogue, isn't it?
Yeah, like by being siloed, we can carry on being oppressed. So like by working together, you know? So I think like they paved that way, and we just need to have that reminder.
Yeah. I would also say I'm not afraid of being 50 now. I'm not afraid of being 60, because now I know that as I get older, I'll only become more powerful and magnificent. And I learned that by meeting 20 of the most powerful and magnificent women and non-binary other people that I've ever met in my life. And they're just all completely, and they've all said, you know, keep doing you, and you'll get there, and you'll get there. And yeah, they're just like, I've got 20 mad aunties now, and I love it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think that's a superb point to remind all of us that our elders' stories are crucial to helping our young people imagine a whole long, wonderful life ahead of them, and to look forward to the joy of being 60, 70, 80 with great stories to tell. When I was a young queer kid, I didn't have that possibility. I didn't know anybody who was an 80-year-old queer person who could show me what that meant. I started meeting those people in my early 20s, finally, as a historian. And so it reminds us that history also has a real crucial meaning for our younger people. So just to wrap up, let me thank all of you for this wonderful discussion. I wish we had 2 or 3 more hours to talk, because there's so many more questions I'd like to ask. And I'd like to thank everybody who's watching the panel, and to remind folks that the films are showing through the 27th of June, streaming via Frameline. I encourage people to go and watch all 3 of them. They truly are marvelous films. And you can find them on the Frameline website at frameline.org/festival. That's where to go and get your tickets and watch these films via streaming. They're really wonderful. And again, thank you all for participating today, and especially for your amazing effort, your great dauntless work in bringing these marvelous films together. They really are a contribution to our understanding of queer history. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
So much.